Hello. The following is going to be a talk. I'm going to look at the topic of addiction. What do I think addiction is? And what does society think addiction is, particularly in America? The way I see it, an addiction is tied in with trying to escape reality in some fashion that we do repetitively, and then it becomes a habit. And it's a particular type of way of escaping reality that we do over and over. And then it's called an addiction to a particular way, or we would call it a particular substance, perhaps, usually. So I think, for instance, most of us would agree that addictions tend to be talked most of as drug addictions or alcohol addictions. You could argue one and the same thing, that alcohol and drugs are both drugs, and that they're an escape from reality. Of course, everybody knows, I think, on some level, that reality can be painful, and sometimes we may joke and say that so-and-so is just a little bit too much reality for a Friday night. And the word entertainment even alludes, I believe, to a temporary escape from reality, say our onerous jobs or difficult marriages or difficult financial situations. And maybe we just want to go out on a Friday or Saturday night, and we call this blowing off steam or having some entertainment. It's, in my mind, a form of escape from reality, and from time to time, surely it's perhaps very advantageous. I think when we think of the word addiction, we're talking about an escape from reality all too often. Or, in other words, where the consequences, the downsides of this escape, aren't worth it in the long run, especially. So, for instance, the use of excessive amounts of alcohol or heroin or methamphetamines to escape have such strong side effects, if you will, that we call them addictions. Escapes from reality that have consequences far too large, either to ourselves or our family members or society as a whole. And one person or the whole society starts to declare that this is not going to be appropriate. It's not going to fly, so to speak. And that something has to be done about it for the good either of the person involved or the society in general. You might call it the utilitarianism argument by Mill, saying that we need to focus on the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So perhaps the, quote, alcoholic may be deemed to be benefiting perhaps themselves, but not for the greater good of society, or for certain other persons in general. Now, for instance, somebody who drinks too much alcohol will probably end up having a car accident, or more than one. And at a very minimum, they'll wreck their car. They may injure themselves, but there may be other injuries or deaths too. And sometimes this may be called manslaughter, even, the death that results to someone else. Similarly, the meth addict pays a heavy price in time to their health. But additionally, the obtaining of these drugs tends to come from stealing money to pay for them. And this is deemed inappropriate by society as a whole, and so these people on both counts are deemed addicts. On the other hand, consider the excessive watching of television, whereby most figures today say the average American watches an average amount of 5 hours of TV a day. And so such persons are not tended to be called addicts or TV addicts as compared to alcoholics. In other words, alcohol addicts or meth addicts or heroin addicts. Why might this be? In my opinion, it's because the downsides, the side effects of watching too much TV, being a TV addict, are either much less or they're socially accepted, or finally the results may not show immediately. And so there are rehab centers set up for the addiction to alcohol or meth or heroin. But I don't believe there are any addiction centers, rehab centers for TV, let's say watching 5 hours a day. Now, even the item of video game addiction is questionable in society's eye, whereby I believe it was Korea some years ago that started really recognizing the problem with video game addiction, and they actually set up some rehab centers for video game addiction. Apparently the consequences, the downsides, the side effects of video game addiction were becoming more and more noticed. But in America at least, I don't believe there's much of a push to say there are many downsides to watching too much TV. And in part, I believe, because some people are benefiting tremendously, it could be argued, by the excessive amount of TV watching. Advertisers and product producers. And anyone who mines and produces raw materials that go into products that are advertised on TV. Even the devices used to watch TV itself, the programming, provides certain people jobs. And so to be a TV addict could be argued to be a benefit to some people while a detriment to the viewers, perhaps. Furthermore, the consequences of excessive purchasing and the downsides of a lack of initiative and doing of anything productive during those 5 hours a day of TV watching doesn't show up for decades, perhaps, in terms of the impact on our environment and the social problems that go unsolved, and the intellect that doesn't get developed, and ideas that don't get furthered because people are zoning out with TV watching. So the effects, perhaps, of a certain type of addiction may not show up for decades, whereas the effects of imbibing too much alcohol or using heroin can show up almost instantaneously. So for this reason alone, too, the meth addict or the alcohol addict or heroin addict is declared an addict because the results, the downsides, show immediately, not in 10 or 20 years. It's not like a war of attrition where there's a slow decline. Now, another aspect, I believe, to addictions, as defined as such, is that the consequences not only have to be significant, the downsides to escaping reality with whatever means, but there has to be an enabling process going on to pick up the slack, so to speak, to help people continue on regardless of the consequences. So, for instance, I once watched a course on codependency. However we might try to define the term, an example was given of a woman whose husband drank too much alcohol and was termed an alcoholic. And one night he drank too much and ended up in the jail cell. And she was expected by him to come and bail him out and pick him up and bring him home. And the talker of the course on codependency said that as long as she continued to do this, it was called enabling, and his behavior was not going to stop. And that it would be repeated because the consequences to him, that is, were not sufficient for him to stop. He wasn't paying a price for this. So you might say, he wasn't paying a price sufficient to change his desire to escape reality because the consequences to him, that is, were not very big. Now, I would say then that the consequences, though, if someone drinks too much and has a motor vehicle accident and somebody dies, those consequences are not going to be tolerated in society by other people. There will be lawsuits. And similarly, the person who breaks into people's homes to get money or identity information from credit cards and so on to pay for the meth or certain other drugs, those consequences aren't going to be tolerated by society in general either. For society doesn't want a bunch of burglars constantly breaking into their homes, do we? There's no upside to losing one's possessions. Now, of course, if insurance companies totally enabled this loss of burglarization, let's say by paying at least 100% of the loss, if not 200%, well then I suppose no one would complain about being burglarized, and meth addicts or heroin addicts would no longer be called addicts because the consequences of the burglaries they commit to get the drugs would be inconsequential to society as a whole. Whereas, for instance, again, the addiction to television at 5 hours watching a night is not really deemed an addiction because many people are benefiting other than the viewer. As I had mentioned, for instance, the product producers. Now, I'd like to shift gears here a little bit and discuss something that concerns me some, and that is addictions, not just to television, say, that is not typically regarded as an addiction, but the addictions to substances that are called legal, and they're called medicines. Oh, for instance, to say again that an addiction is an escape of a repetitive type from reality means to escape anxiety, basically. For instance, psychoanalysts like Freud and Rollo May, more recent, spent a lot of time, a lot of their writing efforts on the topic of anxiety. That this was basically the number one issue in mankind, how to deal with it. Well, Freud talked about dealing with anxiety with defense mechanisms, but in the modern age, I suppose you could say one of the very commonplace defense mechanisms is the use of drugs. But what if these drugs start to be called medicines then, and then they become enablers, because they're no longer considered escapes, they're considered medicine. The argument even sometimes being made that you would never want to take insulin away from a diabetic, would you? Because you're taking their medicine away. But then the question is, are certain drugs we tend to use these days medicine or escapes from reality? Escapes from anxiety that maybe we should be dealing with more on a cognitive level, so to speak, or spiritual level, rather than just nuking them away with drugs and calling it medicine. For instance, I see a rather pervasive use of the word mood disorder to try and address people with high levels of anxiety, to include those who have suffered a lot of trauma and might well come normally under the rubric of being diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But all too often, I believe, with good reason, that this diagnosis is not often made unless someone has just come off a battlefield. And so, all too often, I believe, a great deal of anxiety is not even termed anxiety. It's termed a mood disorder, typically diagnosed as bipolar disorder or depression, and then the root causes are never addressed because mood disorders are deemed to be largely biological or considerably biological, and so there's no real effort made to get to the root of the problem. And furthermore then, I think no therapist or psychiatrist would ever discuss mood disorders, so to speak, without then very soon afterward urging drug treatment for these, but they won't call this drugs, they'll call it medicine. Now, a few braver doctors, in my opinion, have deemed the use of psychiatric drugs in general to have one common function on the brain, and that's to depress brain function. And thereby, whatever troubles us, whatever anxieties, can be, if you will, nuked away with the appropriate type of drug. Such that, given enough drugs of the proper type, you can make anything painful go away. Even to the extent, say, of using a anesthetic normally used in the operating room. You could make the most heinous crime committed to us acceptable. The anxieties, the pain, psychic pain, acceptable with a anesthetic normally used to knock someone out for an operation. And which, by the way, is exactly what Michael Jackson tended to try to do toward the end of his life, when he was using anesthetics to combat anxiety, basically, and psychic pain, if you will. Now, are we to call anesthetic drugs then medicine also for, let's say, a mood disorder too? Or should we address the root of the problem? Where are we going to draw the line? Now, another term used in psychiatry is delusions, or schizophrenia. And schizophrenia usually talked of as having delusions or misconceptions, as I would put it, of a fixed nature, and that have some kind of impact upon our lives, of a negative nature in general. And so they're called delusions because they have an impact either upon ourselves or others. Now, whether the misconception, if you will, is really that fixed or could be altered with good cognitive therapy is a good question in my mind. But all too often, I think the approach is to address strongly impactful misconceptions or delusions, if you wanted to call them, or what a few call limiting beliefs, to address these as fixed in nature, and then simply to nuke them with, quote, antipsychotic drugs, whereby someone with a delusion is deemed psychotic. And the root of the problem, again, the misconception, is never addressed. It's never rooted out. It's simply, the consequences are simply nuked away with drugs. So that it's an enabling process, I believe, whereby the person never has to change their misconceptions. They simply keep them, and the consequences are nuked away. Often, perhaps, not just with a chemical sense, but the person being put on disability status or just caretaken by a loved one, so they never have to be productive in society. The consequences of their misconceptions don't have a price that they have to pay. They're enabled. Indeed, in my opinion, the antipsychotic drugs are what you would call major tranquilizers, and in fact in England they still are called this. And the difference then being that the effects of suppressing emotions and emotional pain in general, or anxiety, are so strong that you could call them drugs that have basically the same effect as a physical lobotomy, whereby someone goes in and cuts up part of our brain, again, perhaps to relieve anxiety of a strong nature, rather than deal with the root of the problem. Now, I suppose at this point we might wonder then, why wouldn't we call a great many, if not all, psychiatric drugs drugs? Why do we call them medicines, and why do we call long-term users of these drugs medicine users and not addicts? Well, perhaps a major distinction between such persons' usage of psych drugs versus heroin or meth is not only the impact to society or others, but how unpredictable the use of meth and heroin are. For instance, Keith Richards once had a long-term heroin addiction from the Rolling Stones. But many people may not know that he obtained pharmaceutical-grade heroin, and I believe he measured the doses out very carefully, you might say like a scientist. But most heroin users probably have a very unpredictable supply of the drug, and with very unpredictable results, and they're not scientifically measuring it out, if you will, in dosage fashion. And so the results are very unpredictable, both to themselves and society. And furthermore, the impact soon after taking such drugs is immediate and very transient and up and down. Whereas the effects of psych drugs, psychological drugs, whether antidepressants or antipsychotics or lithium, have a strong steady state effect. And the users of these drugs don't go up and down like a yo-yo. In fact, the drugs are said to take time to kick in. and to kick out too if you would want to discontinue. So the effects of suppressing emotions with psych drugs are much more predictable. Perhaps this is one of the major reasons then why they're not considered drugs but medicine, along of course with the fact that there is quite a cottage industry, to put it lightly, much money to be made through the manufacture of psych drugs to certain people. I'm reminded too of the complaints of Russell Brand in England concerning rehab centers there, whereby he says that for the few who can get into rehab for alcohol or drugs of different sorts, almost always come out with a new drug of choice addiction, and that's to methadone. But the unwritten truth is that methadone produces results that are much more predictable. You don't go on a yo-yo effect, perhaps, from methadone, but the person who used the drugs of other choices did have a very unpredictable life, and this alone was very problematic compared to the use of methadone as a drug of choice. And so look too at a couple facts I can bring up. At one point, Wyoming, the state, was deemed to have the most egregious use of alcohol, the most alcoholics, you might say, in the country. And so per capita, and the basic argument being it was so lonely there, the emotional pain so great from isolation, rural areas and all, that the people turn to alcohol as a drug of choice. But as I've been talking, with great consequences if alcohol is used. And then I've read that Iowa at one point had the greatest use of antidepressants per capita. You could argue again an escape from reality, a drug of choice, but with more steady state results. The results were more predictable. A person didn't go up and down on a minute-by-minute basis like the alcoholic did with their use of alcohol. For further information, a person might want to take a look at the book Comfortably Numb. So you might say psychiatric drugs in the long term can be producing a numbing effect, whereas alcohol produces an up and down effect. Very unpredictable and transient, just like heroin and meth too. So one is called a drug and one is called a medication. Now I personally have no moral qualms, no issues with anybody wanting to zone out, so to speak, or do their own thing, to escape emotional pain in any which way, whether they want to do it with drugs or TV, or whether they want alternatively to address the root of the problem. I think they have free choice. They have the right to do what they will. With one exception, of course, and that is, what are the long-term effects to their family and their communities and their country and even the world at large? What are the effects, say, to the educational system if so many people are zoned out, escaping reality too much? What are the effects of the morals? What are the effects on the environment? What are the effects on social problems and science that aren't growing but regressing? You might say that This is causing a collapse of the society and maybe the Western world. I'm going to close with something that my physician once said, and I believe I've heard it from several other sources too, and that is, sometimes it takes a real calamity in our lives to wake up that we need a change and need to address things we've been running from all our lives. And for instance, my physician, family physician, says that getting cancer, I suppose usually at an older age, let's say 60 or 70, is a blessing in disguise. And he says many of his patients who develop cancer regard it as a wake-up call. I would say a wake-up call for years or decades of life semi-squandered in escape from reality, from one, shall we say, drug of choice or another, some escape mechanism, perhaps often socially acceptable and even promoted. So we're talking escapes other than alcohol or meth or heroin. And then this can be a reorientation to life, albeit rather late in life, and sadly in certain respects, but still some of these patients regard it as a wake-up call, and they're glad they got cancer because their illness cannot be denied. They're no longer being enabled, so to speak. And I suppose one reason why they're not being enabled anymore is because cancer shortens lifespan rather dramatically, usually, doesn't it? And you can't make that go away, no matter how much you nuke yourself with drugs, unless you do it to the point where you're using anesthetic drugs that totally knock you out. Otherwise, it's rather difficult to deny on a cognitive level that you're soon going to die. I would close by bringing up a topic of why maybe certain drugs of choice are not considered escapes, but medicine, to include, let's say, to the extent where we don't tend to raise an eyebrow coping with life by watching an average of 5 hours TV at night or day. Well, I suppose the effect of psych drugs in particular to suppress brain function, or you might say produce a comfortably numb effect, is being enabled all too often because all too many people use these drugs now, and the effect being a numbing of emotions and creativity and thought, and after a point in time we've come to accept this as almost normal. You might say if someone is using too many psych drugs, they might once have been termed a zombie as to how they look, but if too many people look like zombies, then I suppose it's the new look. It's like a fashion almost, and nobody questions it. And furthermore, if these drugs then impact our emotional ability to relate with one another pleasurably, it's being enabled by vicariously interacting with television and movies. Especially if the actors sometimes have received depth therapy or psychoanalysis or means by which to cope with emotional struggles, anxiety, other than by use of drugs, or psych drugs in particular. And so many people today, I think, watch television to vicariously interact with people because they can't do it so well themselves if they're all numbed out. Nobody derives much emotional satisfaction dealing with someone numbed out or a semi-zombie, do they? They'd rather watch someone emotionally intact who has feelings and can express them, etc., on the television screen. And so we tend to have emotional interactions vicariously now by viewing people instead of actually interacting ourselves back and forth in real time. Additionally, there was once the word schizoid and the term schizoid personality disorder to describe people who spent too much time alone, or you might say alone with intellectual pursuits like data and objects. But today, this is done so commonly that I think very few people would be called schizoids who do this, or even loners, but it's simply so accepted now, and everything is redefined. And then what about obesity or the addiction to food? There are so many obese people today that it's really not considered that much of an issue, not considered an addiction much. And the same with the use of ADHD drugs. You might argue again to suppress brain function from anxiety, and that these drugs produce a zoning effect, and so many people are using them now that this is almost the new look, a non-emotional approach to life. It's not considered unusual anymore. And so this is some concern to me, that there are so many new forms of addiction in the last half century that have become so commonplace, and the side effects to emotionality and productivity and the intellect in general seem to be swept under the rug, especially all the more commonplace as they're being found to be. I know this is a controversial topic, and what I bring up is going to prick some people tremendously, but I think we could all stand as a society and a world to examine the long-term effects of our ways of dealing with emotional pain from anxiety generally, and are we escaping all too often by use of means that are very commonplace now and termed medicines or medications instead of a new form of drug of choice? What are the consequences to our society and world in the long term, such that you might say our society could be collapsing very rapidly, and in fact the world, mankind as a species, could soon go extinct. I wish you well.